Metroidvanias and exploration. They're a dynamic duo. They go together like peanut butter and jelly. But what are they really like behind the scenes? Well, that's the topic we're going to explore today. Oh, get over it. Super Metroid and Symphony of the Night are the games that gave the genre we now call Metroidvania its name. They're commonly seen as the definitive examples of the upgrade-based, exploration-focused design that so many popular games have followed over the last 2 decades. There's just one problem. The 2 games really aren't all that alike. Okay, all clickbait aside, the 2 games obviously have several important features in common. A large open map shown to the player as a grid of colored squares, upgrade-based progression that gradually opens up new areas for exploration, a sense of immersion that comes from atmosphere rather than a linear story. But at the same time, the feel of the 2 games is very different. Super Metroid is quiet and thoughtful, sometimes to the point of being tedious, while Symphony of the Night is frenetic and action-heavy. Symphony of the Night's challenge is almost completely combat-focused. Super Metroid is a stronger focus on platforming and, well, puzzle-solving, kind of. These differences aren't the result of a designer's whim, but a reflection of the central difference between the 2, how they handle exploration. I often hear exploration discussed as if it were a single kind of gameplay that a developer can either put into a game or leave out, but the way I see it, there are at least 3 very different types: linear exploration, limited exploration, and free exploration. Super Metroid has what I call linear exploration. It's actually a lot more straightforward than many people think, and while you can often go in multiple directions, only one leads to progress at any given time. The key to this category is that exploration is a challenge, and the central gameplay hook is finding the correct path forward. It's kind of like a hedge maze. There are 100 dead ends you can run across, but there's only one way out. Symphony of the Night, on the other hand, has limited exploration. It starts out very linear, but gradually gives the player more freedom to explore as the game goes on. At multiple stages in the game, you have several different directions you can go in. Usually these areas will all need to be completed at some point, but at least a few of them are completely optional. Unlike Super Metroid, where most of the map is covered just in the process of getting essential upgrades, Symphony of the Night can be finished with a large section of the map left undiscovered. In games like this, you generally don't explore to find the way forward, but to find optional upgrades and challenges. The third type, free exploration, usually isn't found in Metroidvanias at all, but that doesn't mean it's uncommon. Far from it. This is the kind of exploration you see in every MMO and open-world sandbox game. In this kind of game, almost all of the content is completely optional. If there is a required set of levels, it usually takes up only a small portion of the world. Games like this can be completed with most of the map left entirely unexplored. I think it's obvious that this third kind of exploration is by far the most popular for big game releases these days. Sandbox games hit the big time back in the early 2000s with Grand Theft Auto 3, and since then it's just about the only exploration genre that's remained popular in the face of shifting design trends. Limited exploration is less common, but among Metroidvanias this is still the default when it comes to level design. Linear exploration, though, is hard to find anywhere these days. Why is this? And what makes a game like Super Metroid so different from the games it's supposed to have inspired? Let's find out. Super Metroid was and is an unusual game. Its primary challenge doesn't come from combat or platforming, both of which are usually pretty easy, although the game can be irritatingly difficult at times. Instead, the challenge comes from finding your way around and discovering a path forward with the tools you have at any given moment. You don't have to be a genius to play Super Metroid. In fact, it doesn't really have any traditional puzzles at all. But the game does make you use your brain in a way that most games don't. And this ties into a complaint that I've often heard about the Metroid series, that it has too much backtracking. Strictly speaking, this isn't fair to Super Metroid, which has a very tight upgrade path and several ways in and out of each area. This wouldn't be the game that started the speedrunning craze if every playthrough was a tedious slog of backtracking. At the same time, though, I can see where this sentiment comes from, because if you're not good at Super Metroid, you can end up retracing your steps a lot and getting lost. Like I said earlier, it's a maze, and mazes have lots of dead ends. Super Metroid expects you to make smart decisions about getting around. If you don't, it punishes you by making you retrace your steps. And this is where Super Metroid's low traditional difficulty works against it, because it makes players expect an easy time, and consequently makes the game more frustrating. Super Mario Bros. Often punishes players far more harshly. You might play the same level, with exactly the same content, for half an hour because of a few small mistakes. Yet I've never heard anyone say that Super Mario Bros. Is tedious because of its high difficulty. Is this a double standard, or is it that Mario is fun to play even when you're not making progress? Probably a little of both, which is why even though Super Metroid is an acknowledged classic, you'll find lots of people who don't enjoy it at all. In other words, making a Metroidvania in the style of Super Metroid is risky. Super Metroid can be a lot of fun, but it's not simple fun like you get with a more traditional game. Okami and the original Legend of Zelda have more in common with Super Metroid than most Metroidvanias do, and while these games have great reputations, they also tend to be confusing and even frustrating at times. Most importantly, if you want open exploration or a meaningful sense of player choice, you have to look elsewhere. Yeah, like there. Symphony of the Night wasn't necessarily the quantum leap in design for the Castlevania series that it's sometimes described as. Simon's Quest, flawed though it was, provided a basic template for Konami to build on. Non-linear progression, backtracking, upgrade-focused gameplay, and so on. But Symphony of the Night had so much more of everything, and did it so much better, that it's acquired a legendary reputation among fans of Metroidvanias. Far more than Super Metroid, this is the progenitor of the classic Metroidvania design that we've seen so many times in recent years. And the hallmarks of that design are player choice and strong combat. Symphony of the Night is very linear at the start, but that linearity doesn't come from a lack of mobility upgrades. It's built into the way the map is designed. Even if you somehow started with all the upgrades, the first 2 levels of Symphony of the Night would still feel about the same. By about a quarter of the way through the game, the map starts to really open up and let you choose where you go next. This is the opposite of Super Metroid, where your ability to go through any area was strictly limited by what upgrades you'd acquired elsewhere. Symphony of the Night in general features a much greater sense of variety than Super Metroid. You can pick between several types of primary weapon, summon a familiar, use a shield, cast offensive spells, throw a peanut into the air and try to catch it in your mouth for extra healing. Overall, it's a much more eclectic game experience than wandering through the gloomy caverns of Planet Zebes, both in gameplay and in tone. Another big difference is combat. In Super Metroid, enemies are simple and easy to avoid. Getting from room to room is much harder than fighting enemies, and some rooms are so big that just getting from one corner to another is a major challenge. Symphony of the Night has simpler rooms for the most part, but it fills them with difficult and varied combat challenges. Far from being a mere nuisance, enemies in Symphony of the Night make up the vast majority of the game's content, apart from just picking things up. Because of its huge map and large number of areas, plus the need to revisit certain areas periodically, the library comes to mind, Symphony of the Night actually threatens the player with the possibility of a lot more tedious backtracking than Super Metroid ever had. The developers solved this problem with a novel mechanic, warp points. Symphony of the Night could arguably have done without them, but warping has become indispensable to most Metroidvanias since. It's a little sad, actually. Warp points stick out like a sore thumb and often bend the map design around themselves, and I can think of several games that have them even though they really shouldn't. Yeah, I see you over there. Honestly, the strongest claim to embodying Symphony of the Night's design philosophy in 3D belongs to Dark Souls of all things. It has the combat focus, the branching area map, the judicious mix of shortcuts and warp points, not to mention all these things.
You can pick between several types of primary weapon, summon a familiar, use a shield, cast offensive spells, throw a peanut into the air and try to catch it in your mouth for extra healing.
Okay, so it doesn't really have the peanut thing, but I think we can all agree that it should. This may be a strange sentiment, but my opinion is that it's easier to make a good game like Symphony of the Night than it is to make one like Super Metroid. Building a rich world and filling it with fun challenges isn't exactly easy, but it's certainly easier than doing that and giving the world a compelling difficulty curve and sense of progression. Symphony of the Night is an extremely easy game that often, especially in the late game, feels more like a sandbox than a proper Metroidvania. I think it's worth noting that its ending is one of the least interesting parts of the game, while Super Metroid's ending is a climactic moment and one of the game's highlights. I think this is partly because Super Metroid's level design builds up to the ending, which Symphony of the Night's more open structure pretty much makes impossible. At the same time, Symphony of the Night is still a compelling mix of structure and player freedom, which is why there have been so many games that follow the same pattern. Hollow Knight, A Link to the Past, Banjo-Kazooie, I'm just hitting the highlights here. But these games do still rely on a certain amount of structure. They require the player to overcome challenges in a sequence that's at least somewhat predictable from a design standpoint. Exploration had a lot farther to go before it was done evolving. And that brings us to... So far we've seen exploration as a challenge, a la Super Metroid, and exploration as a form of player choice, a la Symphony of the Night. But sandboxes feature a completely different setup. Here we see exploration as a form of player engagement. Open-world games don't just offer you choices, but demand that you make them as a major part of gameplay. It's up to the player to decide how events will progress, like a set of Lego bricks that you have to put together in your own way. The main advantage of an open-world sandbox is obvious. It lets players focus on what they enjoy in games and avoid what they don't. Do you find that one boss really annoying? Just skip it. No need to beat your head against a wall. Do you hate stealth missions with a passion? You don't have to do any of them. For these kinds of games, exploration works as an antidote to frustration, letting you escape from challenges that aren't to your taste and wander until you come across something better. Since these games are designed to feature lots of content and varied gameplay, it's unlikely that you'll be bored for long. The disadvantages of complete player freedom are a little more subtle and hard to identify, so I'll have to resort to an extended metaphor to make my point. To me, a sandbox game is the virtual equivalent of an all-you-can-eat buffet. A buffet offers a wide selection of food for a set price and lets you eat until you're full. Not only can you pick your favorite items and avoid everything else, but you can get 4 plates of the stuff you like for the same price as a regular meal. Given these advantages, why would any other restaurant be in business besides a buffet? Well, there's several reasons for this. First, the quality of buffet food is generally pretty low. The individual dishes are cheap and mass-produced, made before you get there and not to order. Try to get a good steak at a buffet restaurant and you'll be sorely disappointed. Second, even if you really like a dish, you may not like it enough to eat 4 plates of it. In trying to take full advantage of a buffet, people often find themselves eating more than they really enjoy and feeling bloated when they're done. But the last problem, possibly the most important one, is that chefs know how to put together an impressive meal better than most diners do. A good meal at a traditional restaurant progresses from course to course in a way that's appetizing at the beginning and satisfying at the end. A buffet meal, on the other hand, is more often than not just a pile of random food on a plate. While there's nothing in the sandbox game template that makes mediocre content inevitable, it does tend to produce mediocrity for the same reasons buffets tend to serve up bland food. When you have to serve up dozens of hours of gameplay, making every minute fresh and unique is next to impossible. But you have to produce dozens of hours of content because otherwise the whole idea of player choice goes out the window. If you only have 10 hours worth of game to choose from, you're not going to be happy if half of it isn't to your taste. The second problem is even more insidious because it ruins the fun of exploration, which is ostensibly the whole point. Sandbox games tend to have a lot of exploration because the world is so big, but with cookie-cutter content spread thinly over that huge world, the exploration suffers from serious diminishing returns as time goes on. Usually the developer solves this problem by adding a fast travel system, but this essentially takes the core design feature of exploration and makes it optional, just like all the other content. Instead of being the reason you play the game in the first place, freely exploring the environment becomes just one more thing that's not worth doing, one more thing to skip in favor of more interesting content. This brings us to the third problem, the one about how an experience is put together, and I think this is a good time to bring the 3 types of exploration together and compare how they solve this basic problem. Free exploration solves the problem of design like a buffet, by providing so much content that structure isn't necessary. This approach requires a lot of grunt work to make all the necessary content, but it doesn't require much innovation or creativity. It's no coincidence that this is the favored model for MMOs. It's simple, works across lots of different genres, and easily fits in new content without ruining what's already in place. But that's partly because, as far as story and progression are concerned, there's not much there to begin with. Linear exploration takes the opposite approach. Nothing is optional, and exploration is a serious challenge that punishes you if you screw up. The content itself is often pretty simple, but it's the way it's put together that makes the finished product special. Games that feature linear exploration often feel complete from a design perspective, and adding more content will break that sense of coherence. You won't see DLC come out for a game that's structured like Super Metroid. And then we have limited exploration, which basically hedges its bets. It has one foot in the linearity camp and one in the player freedom camp, but usually the most important game content is mandatory and fairly linear. Games like this can have the best of both worlds and feel challenging and varied, but they can also feel like a directionless mess created by designers who couldn't make up their minds. I'm a big fan of Metroidvanias, but I feel like too many of them follow the Symphony of the Night template and end up feeling eerily similar to each other as a result. The Super Metroid approach of treating the world like a puzzle is underused, but the few games that have followed it have absolutely blown the Castlevania clones away. There's no comparison. As for the sandbox games, with their open, optional exploration, I'm just not a fan of games where so little of what you do matters, both in terms of challenge and plot. Exploration with structure makes me feel like I'm going on an adventure. Exploration without structure makes me feel like I'm wandering around a shopping mall. I've often heard people say that Metroid, as a series, doesn't really have a story. In the sense of expository text and dialogue, they're mostly correct, but to me, that's the least important aspect of a game's story. What holds my attention is how one thing leads to another along a thread of logic, and Super Metroid does that brilliantly. Really, all the Metroid games have a story in that sense, even the mediocre ones. Video games have always occupied an uncomfortable position that sits between storytelling and gameplaying. I feel like exploration as a game mechanic is very well understood these days, but exploration as a form of storytelling is still underdeveloped. Story and gameplay don't have to be at odds with one another in this respect any more than they do generally. Super Metroid had both, and I think that's one of the biggest reasons why it has such a good reputation. Metroidvanias these days aren't samey because the designers aren't talented enough to reproduce the magic of linear exploration that Super Metroid had. They're samey because the designers haven't even tried to reproduce it. It's a game that has the dubious honor of being both widely praised and widely misunderstood. Actually, now that I think about it, Hunters is the one Metroid game that doesn't really have a story. Ugh, Hunters.